go to the next slide, right? You will notice the flag on the left, Chinese Taipei, is the one the competing on Olympics. The one on the right, can anyone name what it is officially called? Yes, that's the flag of the Republic of China. And oftentimes, the way it'll be framed is like the Republic of China in parentheses Taiwan, or vice versa, right? And there's sort of a conventional Western media narrative around this, right? Around this juxtaposition that says the flag on the right is the flag of Taiwan, right? And that because China is a bad authoritarian neighbor, right, does not want to concede sovereignty to this small independent sovereign of Taiwan. They make them adopt this weird flag on the left, which is only used for the Olympics, right? And it's just called Chinese Taipei. That is a conventional narrative, right? And it fits in with, and it brings in a bunch of different conventional narratives that we see in Western media. So, go to the next slide. I want to start off just by asking, anyone who wants to suggest something, right? What some common narratives, you've heard about Taiwan, in media, in school, right? Just in sort of everyday conversation, what passes for common sense. Yeah, that's pretty much what I'm going to go. Any others? Yeah, that too is a very common narrative. Often counterposed with this idea that modern China's claim to sovereignty over Taiwan is illegitimate, right? That has no historical basis. Yeah, any other?
It's building on that. China's occupation as an imperialist institution or including on.
Yeah, so almost in like any given news story where Taiwan comes up, right? Even in the context of something like the Olympics, where Western reporters have to explain to their audiences why this whole Chinese Taipei phenomenon. You will hear some or all of those narratives about that, right? It's a set of messages, right, that they're sort of hitting, they're hitting us with like a drum, right? And so, next slide. So because of the centrality of these narratives to the current, ideological and material, right, economic, military, etc., Cold War that the United States is waging on China, we at Qiao Collective decided, as I said, years ago to begin work on what has become actually our longest resource list, our longest single piece of written work over the course of our 40-year existence. It clocks in at a good 30,000 words, so it's a monster, really. But it came out in early February, the link is there. And it goes into very exacting detail about the history, about all these details that I don't really have time for today. But putting that out there. And next slide. We were also asked to contribute to the current July to August issue of Monthly Review. I think the oldest socialist magazine in the United States, one of the most illustrious as well. And the fine folks at Midnight Books were gracious enough to bulk order some copies. So please do support them and support Monthly Review by picking up a copy after the talk. It's not just our article in there. It covers a whole range of different angles on the topic of imperialism in the Pacific. But this is our contribution, the sort of a condensed version of our previous resource list, right? And the thing is that like both the resource list, the timeline, and this article are kind of going in fairly strict chronological order for the history. And that can be a little bit dry. So in the spirit of how I opened this talk, I wanted to structure this a little bit more around, looking at these misconceptions, these common narratives, which in many cases amount to myths, I would say, or at least half-truths at best, right? One by one, and sort of build out the history in that pattern. So, we go to the next slide. The first narrative that I want to address is this notion that Taiwan is not a part of China culturally, ethnically, or linguistically. This is something that I think has started, to be accepted almost as common knowledge in the West, particularly in recent decades, even though it would have been very alien for folks who, recall the days of the Cold War, for instance. And I'll talk a little bit about how that shift happened. But, if we just, drill down into, okay, how much validity does this have? Next slide. We can start with the issue of language, right? Here on the left, we have a map of Taiwan. And basically each of the different administrative divisions is shaded according to which language or dialect is most spoken at home. And basically, all is mattering where an indigenous language actually is. If you look at sort of trends by age, then you'll see that the orange line, trends by age for primary language, and see that as you get to younger and younger people, it is overwhelmingly Mandarin Chinese, right, which is the official dialect in both Taiwan and China that is overwhelmingly the primary language, particularly for younger generations. And so, without getting at the moment into the history of how this came about, what we see is that there's nothing really distinguishing, Taiwan from, for example, Fujian province or across the strait, right, in terms of the linguistic picture. And indeed, that you would find greater differences here between, for example, Fujian and its neighboring provinces in mainland China than between Fujian and Taiwan. Next slide. And then, another way to look at this is through the dimension of ethnicity, right? The sort of image on the left is actually, an official infographic, basically, from the, government of the Republic of China, Taiwan. And it's not like, they have the age and the ethnic breakdown like a little bit unknowingly matched together, but what you see at the bottom is that, that light blue portion of the pie chart, which goes almost all the way around and comes to 95% of it, is Han Chinese ethnicity, right? And you have another 2.5% or so who are the indigenous population, and another 2.5 that are new immigrants. Again, this is, something that was put out officially by what is actually like a pro-independence, by the government of the ROC for Taiwan, under what is actually like a pro-independence administration, right? They themselves are saying Taiwan, 95% Han Chinese. On the other hand, on the right, what you see is that if you look at mainland China, it's about 91.6% Han Chinese, with the rest of the population being various minority groups. So that means that Taiwan, in fact, is actually more homogeneously Han Chinese now than the mainland itself, right? So, on that point, this claim of ethnic difference, I think, falls apart. But we can look a little closer, next slide, at how that Han Chinese population is broken down. And so we see, on the left there is we can sort of break down the Han Chinese population into sort of two main subgroups, and then another two within one of those, right? The major sort of social and cultural distinction is between the so-called Ren, which means the people of the province, right, referred to Taiwan as a province, and the Western, meaning sort of more recent, essentially post-1945 migrants from mainland China and their descendants. And they're the ones labeled here in this green slice as mainland Chinese. So they comprise about 14% of the population, and then within I guess, 84 or 85% who are the Benjamin, right, whose ancestors came from mainland China, but, so before 1945, they're broken down between the Hoklo, right, and that is a, Fujianese word that really means originally from Fujian province on the mainland, and the Hakka, who I mentioned earlier, right. So, already within this pie chart, you can sort of see, sort of bit by bit how Taiwan's modern demographics came about through successive waves of migration, and that's something I'm going to be going into in a little bit more detail. But I guess the important takeaway from this is that this modern narrative that attributes an essentialist cultural or ethnic difference, right, is founded on basically taking these distinctions, particularly within the Han Chinese population, based on generation, based on language, right, and other factors, and magnifying them into supposedly ethnic differences. And it's gone so far, in fact, that at this point, a full quarter of the population of Taiwan in surveys claims, or at least considers themselves to be Indigenous Austronesian, even though the actual figure is a tenth of that. So, that's interesting. And I'll be talking a little bit about, again, the ideological project that has led to this. But for now, next slide. We go a little bit more into the history of, how the, different peoples of the island arrived, right? So to start with the Indigenous Taiwanese, also known as the Yuan in Mandarin, their ancestors, we think around 6,000 years or so ago, came from the Chinese mainland, and kind of spread across the island, and then from that point forward, if we go to the next slide, actually, many of their descendants wound up becoming, incredible seafarers, right? Taiwan was the origin of what's now called the Austronesian expansion, where over the course of around 1,000 or 1,500 years, the descendants of, again, this original group that's a common ancestor of today's Indigenous Taiwanese, also then spread first to the Philippines and what is today Malaysia, Indonesia, right, most of Southeast Asia, and I think all the way across the Indian Ocean to Madagascar, while in the other direction they expanded out to Micronesia, Melanesia, and then Polynesia, as far east as Hawaii and Rapa Nui, aka Easter Island, and as far south as Aotearoa, aka New Zealand. So, some truly extraordinary history there, but, of course, it wasn't every one of them, right? If you go to the next slide. The, indigenous peoples of the island themselves, with these 6,000 years of history, had, an incredibly sort of diverse population across the entire island to begin with. You can see on the left-hand side, sort of the traditional territories of each of these different indigenous groups prior to contact with European colonizers, actually. And on the right-hand side, you can see sort of the 16 officially recognized indigenous groups in the sort of mostly eastern highlands of the island. And I'll be talking a little bit about why, it's only those groups that have managed to hold on to, an appreciable, I'd say, distinct indigenous identity, as opposed to the lowlands, which are sort of that gray area. the origin or the point of divergence of another, narrative that I would describe as fundamentally, a half-truth at best and actually in fact a false at worst, which is this idea that, Taiwan, as a political entity was historically independent until it came up under, Chinese rule, Colonial. And, this is actually a narrative that is sometimes extended forward in time as well, right? That every instance of political separation of Taiwan from mainland China is then used as historical basis for a claim to continue. Slide. So the actual sort of state of things, or the point of origin of this narrative, for a lot of the pro-independence camp actually comes from the fact that in the early 1600s, parts of Taiwan in the south by the Dutch and then the north by the Spanish came under European colonization. This is relatively short-lived compared to many other parts of the world. The Spanish only held out from 1624 to 1642, and then before the Dutch kicked them out, and the Dutch themselves only held out for another 20 years after that. Nonetheless, there are elements of the pro-independence camp in Taiwan who actually positively sort of identify, right, with this period, this relatively brief period of Dutch colonization in particular, as like, a major point of divergence from the rest of China. I should add that, owing to sort of like natural migration from the mainland, there was already a Han Chinese population at the time of European colonization in the thousands or so, in the low thousands. And this was not the result of any kind of state-backed project in China. In fact, the successive Chinese dynasties, up to and including the Ming dynasty, which was in power at the time, didn't really care about the existence of Taiwan until you had political turmoil within the mainland. So next slide. Basically, what you had around the same time as this early period of European colonization in Taiwan was a major upheaval and a change of dynasties on the mainland, where the Manchus in what is today Northeast China basically swept through and overthrew the Ming dynasty and established the Qing dynasty. This was a very abrupt political transition that was perceived by many sort of Han Chinese as a foreign conquest. And for that reason, there were all kinds of like insurrections by Ming loyalists, Ming restorations, and one of them, this guy on the left, Zheng Xianggong, who was also known as Qing, basically set up base in Fujian province, right in Southeast China, right across the strait from Taiwan. And he's like, okay, this is not the best base of operations for me to retake all of China to the Qing dynasty, but what would be is this island right across the strait, Taiwan. And so he basically joined forces with both Han Chinese migrants and indigenous peoples on Taiwan to kick out the Dutch and convert Taiwan for the first time in its history as a potential base for retaking the mainland. He was not successful in this though, and ultimately, because of the presence of this oppositional force there, the Qing dynasty wound up themselves overthrowing that regime, right? However, they didn't take over the entire island. Next slide. In fact, over the next 2 centuries, the Qing dynasty itself displayed significant reticence, I think, in actually pursuing any kind of recognizable intentional settler colonial projects in Taiwan. They in fact severely restricted Han Chinese migration to the island. They for long stretches of time, banned it entirely, and they also even more strictly enforced a ban on Han Chinese movement within this area that's shaded in black, right, which basically corresponds to eastern highlands. They very intentionally reserved those, right, for the indigenous Taiwan peoples, and that more or less remained the case until almost the very very end of dynastic rule in China. It's still a contested question whether the overall policy can be considered in some sense colonial, but the state very much was aiming to restrict Chinese migration to the island, to reserve the majority of the territory for indigenous peoples, and essentially not to actually exercise sovereignty over the island. That is until, next slide, until other imperialists came knocking at the door. So basically throughout the 19th century, the Qing dynasty, was weakening both internally and externally. This is the beginning of what's called the Century of Humiliation. And basically, we had was imperial and colonial powers, right? Mostly Western powers, but also Japan, eyeing various peripheral parts of Qing territory comfortably, right, and seeking, to annex them, to basically semi-colonize parts of China, to obtain favorable trade arrangements, right? And when it came to Taiwan in particular, interestingly, the United States briefly had its eye on it and considered annexing it. Ultimately, it didn't opt to do so, but Japan at this point, was undergoing Navy restoration, seeking to modernize along European colonial lines, and ended up, looking at Taiwan, right, as one of the prime targets. And in fact, it was precisely the Qing dynasty's refusal to exercise effective sovereignty and to sort of control indigenous populations in large swaths of the island that served as a pretext for Japan to come in with its supposed civilizing mission, right, and actually subdue these people whom it saw as savages. And so this is like a Japanese depiction of one of these punitive expeditions they launched in Taiwan in 1894, and then next slide, about a decade later, the last one was 1874, and then in 1884, we had the Sino-French War, where France was, essentially seeking to colonize Vietnam, which at that point was a tributary state of China, and that ended up, the theater of war sort of ended up expanding to include much of the southern coast as well as Taiwan, right? And so you had these repeated incursions now by foreign colonial powers. The Qing dynasty decides, okay, actually maybe this island is pretty strategic, and that's why, if you remember a couple slides ago, that last image on the right from 1894 showed, much larger plain territory than Taiwan, right? This is something that the dynasty very much was forced into, right, by competing imperialist interests, and it did ultimately come too little too late. So, slide. Basically 10 years after that, just after the incorporation or elevation of Taiwan to a province in its own right, Japan defeats China in the First Sino-Japanese War, and one sort of condition of the sort of peace settlement is that China has to give up Taiwan to Japan, right? The people of Taiwan themselves do not take this line down. They establish a short-lived de facto state called, it's usually translated in English as the Republic of Formosa, Formosa being, a word of Portuguese origin. That was sort of the standard name for Taiwan up to this point. This is its flag on the right, and they fiercely fought the Japanese occupation, even though, and even though it was the Qing dynasty itself that had ultimately agreed to at gunpoint to cede Taiwan to Japan, the motto that was raised on the banners of the Republic of Formosa was, Qing or forever Qing, right? Indicating the continued sort of loyalty to Chinese sovereignty. Nonetheless, they didn't have, they weren't able to hold out against this rapidly sort of modernizing Japanese military, and that became under Japanese rule. So this takes us to the next myth, which is this idea that Taiwan was a model colony of independence. And this, can sort of be understood in two senses, right? One with this idea that Japan, compared to its later colonial ventures, took sort of a lighter touch in Taiwan, right? On the other hand, that Taiwan itself was politically quiescent, right? More or less accepted Japanese rule, did not engage in kind of like mass resistance, right? That you would see sort of later when Japan expanded even more ambitiously, into mainland China, the kind of resistance that you saw, for example, in Korea from the start of the Japanese colonial period, and then throughout the rest of Asia during World War II. This narrative is fundamentally false as well. So, go to the next slide. There were a number of, large-scale armed uprisings against Japanese rule, which were put down brutally, right? This is an image from the Wuxi incident in 1930, which was led by Indigenous people. And as you can see, as part of the campaign of repression that the Japanese colonialists waged, they sort of, massacred and beheaded, Indigenous people by the hundreds, if not thousands. This particular campaign also involved the first use of chemical weapons in warfare in all of these areas. And it was just one of dozens of primarily sort of Indigenous-led uprisings, but often with significant participation from the half-power. On the other hand, Japan did engage not just in sort of repressive counterinsurgency, but in a process of trying to remold, the identity of Taiwanese people, predominantly Han-Chinese Taiwanese people, into loyal and defiant imperial subjects. This is the process called Colonial, which basically means becoming subjects of the emperor, and it entailed, the large-scale replacement of Chinese by Japanese in the press, in education, in all spheres of state life. It involved the replacement of traditional sort of ancestor worship by state Shinto and worship of the emperor. So this is an example of one of the classrooms in which this ideological remolding took place, right? And it also involves the imposition of Japanese names, right? The replacement of Chinese by Japanese names. So this is a project that whose success in some ways overstated, but it did have some notable successes. We go to the next slide. One of those is the guy on the right here. His name is Zhenghui. He sort of willingly adopted a Japanese name. He and his brother, who was on the left, voluntarily enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Army. Actually both fought, for Japan in World War II. His brother, the one on the left, wound up actually being enshrined at the infamous Yasukuni Shrine in Japan, which is also where 14 Class A war criminals and about 1,000 other war criminals are enshrined, right? And he himself, Zhenghui on the right, winds up eventually becoming, president of the Republic of China, or Taiwan, and in many ways the sort of father of the modern independence movement. If we go to the next slide, his sort of attachment to, not just Japan in general, but to this imperial Japanese legacy really persisted in a quite notorious way. He visited the Yasukuni Shrine with his brother several times, right? To a rapturous reception by right-wing Japanese nationalists, as you can see. But the thing is that, this kind of amnesia or deliberate whitewashing of the crimes of imperial Japan, right? Not just in Taiwan, but throughout its former empire, including in China. may be a somewhat extreme example in this respect, but that element of the ideology, I would say, is actually quite prevalent throughout the mainstream of the modern-day approach. And it comes from this attachment to the Japanese colonial period, right, as one where Taiwan was a model colony, or indeed as someone having not a colony at all, but a full-blown, part of this greater Japan, right? There is a tendency, which is far from universal, but disturbingly common, to view that period in misplaced nostalgia. But it does not go unchallenged. So next slide. What we have here are some images of an indigenous Taiwanese legislator, specifically from the Qiao people. Her name is Cao Sume, and she has led a number of protests specifically against the involuntary enshrinement of indigenous Taiwanese who were conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army, right? And who were then enshrined without their consent, obviously, or the consent of their families, in Yasukuni, alongside all these war criminals, many of whom were responsible for massacring their own people. Right? So this is a narrative that's being quite actively combated, by other forces in Taiwan society, and it's by no means unprecedented. So this sort of brings us then to the complementary narrative, the one that we started with, right? The one I started with was that Taiwan's not part of China culturally, linguistically, or ethnically. And then there's another set of arguments that is deployed to argue that it's not a part of China politically or legally. And to really unpack what's going on here, we then have to rewind a little bit and look at what's happening in mainland China during this period while Japan is under Japanese rule, or while Taiwan is under Japanese rule. So, last we checked in the late 19th century, the Qing dynasty was not in great shape. And indeed, it collapses in 1911 with the Cairo Declaration, right? That ends 2,000 years of dynastic rule in China, and it leads to the establishment of the Republic of China, with this guy in the center, Sun Yat-sen, as the first president. And I guess the contrast in this photo is not great, but you may notice that in the flag on the left there, you have the emblem that we saw earlier, right? In what is today the flag of the ROC, this sort of 12-pointed white sun against a blue background, right? That is the emblem of Sun Yat-sen's party, the Colonial, also known by its acronym, KMT. And that party started out as a sort of progressive bourgeois nationalist party who is seeking to reunite China, right? After, at that point, many decades of sort of, imperial division, as well as, sort of further fragmentation into these fiefdoms led by warlords. And in this project, it was actually joined by the Communist Party, which was founded in 1921 in the United Front for at least several years. Next slide. What ends up happening is that Sun Yat-sen dies. He's succeeded by Chiang Kai-shek, who is, I think, third from the right in this photo, who is much more right-wing, much more anti-communist, purchased the communists in 1927, and then, proceeds to not only reunify China in 1928, right, under the banner, again, of the KMT, whose emblem you can see much more clearly here. This is a ceremony to mark the end of the so-called Northern Expedition, and, the start of one-party rule over time, right? And this should hopefully, serve to demonstrate that, why it is that we're still talking, officially at least, about the Republic of China, right? And what the origin of this particular symbol is. Next slide. Yes, so to sort of fast forward a little bit, and sorry for the wall of text right here, but now we're going to bring Taiwan back into it, right? All of this has been happening, right, with, both parties locked in the civil war, right, the nationalists, the KMT, and the communists, committed to reunifying China, including liberating Taiwan from Japanese rule. And with the Japanese surrender in 1945, that is what happens, right? So we see here on the left, is the ceremony in Taipei that marked the retrocession of Taiwan, right, from Japan back to the Republic of China. And you can see it in those flags. On the left-hand side, you have the party flag, which is just the white sun on the blue. On the right-hand side, again, it's kind of dark, it's a little hard to see, but that is the national flag of the Republic of China, right? So it's that emblem in the top left corner on a red field, and they're crossed to indicate sort of the one-party nature of the state. But also to make unambiguous, right, that Japan is returning sovereignty over Taiwan to the Republic of China. The reason I posted this big block of text here, which is from the Cairo Declaration of 1943, is because part of the legal claim regarding Taiwan's supposedly ambiguous status is that Japan gave up sovereignty over Taiwan but never actually returned it to China, per se. And I don't know if anyone at the front row wants to read that part that is highlighted? Or is that? Yeah, that.
All the territories of Japan have stolen from the Chinese, such as Manchuria, Formosa, and the Pescadores, shall be restored to the Republic of China.
Right, so sort of antiquated names here, right? Formosa is Taiwan, the Pescadores, as they're called, refer to the island of Penghu, which is just to the west of Taiwan. This is a pretty unambiguous statement by the Allies, right, of World War II, that Japan was not just going to be, giving up sovereignty over Taiwan, but returning it to China. Now, if you go to the next slide, the modern-day pro-independence camp likes to point instead to these two other treaties. The one at the top is from the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951, which was signed between Japan and most of the allies of World War II, but notably not with either of the rival governments of China or either of the rival governments of Korea, even though they suffered the most in the Japanese colonial rule. And what you see at the first two items here, right, say that Japan recognizes the independence of Korea. Good. And then part two says Japan renounces all right and claim to Formosa and the Pescadores, but it doesn't say who's returning them to. Not explicitly, right? And in fact, both, the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China objected vociferously to that because it didn't make that explicit. And then the second bit there, I don't want to get too much into detail, but this was the peace treaty that was ultimately signed separately between Japan and the ROC, and it says that nationals of the Republic of China shall be Chinese residents of Taiwan, right? It doesn't necessarily say anything about the territory. So, again, this is a little bit in the weeds legally, but a lot of the modern day, legal claim regarding, Taiwan's separateness from China, right? Its alleged separateness from China is based on a selective reading of these documents, ignoring the actual Japanese instruments around it, which is very unambiguous, that is being returned to the Republic of China. Next slide. I sort of got ahead of myself here, but as I mentioned, the Communist Party of China is kind of doing its thing during all of this, and this was sort of the picture during World War II, right? The green is the areas that were under KMT control, the blue is the areas under Japanese occupation, and then the areas in red are communist-based areas. And so as a result of World War II, the Communist Party gains a lot more experience in guerrilla warfare and manages to greatly expand its overall reach and its level of legitimacy, right? As one of the leading forces of the anti-Japanese resistance. So that leaves us, next slide, in 1945, after the Japanese surrender, in a situation where you have Chiang Kai-shek of the KMT and Mao Zedong of the Communists meeting to briefly try and form a coalition government. That, as you can imagine, does not go well, and the Civil War resumes. Next slide. Basically, for most of the next 4 years, the communists are mostly confined to northeast China, Manchuria, and North China. But then in 1948 and 49, the KMT forces basically collapse completely. The communists sweep through and liberate pretty much the entirety of mainland China. And go to the next slide. Ultimately, once they sweep over to South China, the government of the Republic of China, having completely lost its actual popular legitimacy, it kind of rapidly flees between a bunch of different cities before ultimately packing up and exiling itself to Taiwan, along with about 1 million troops and a ton of China's gold reserves and a bunch of looted art as well. So, sort of pulled up in their island redoubt of Taiwan, the KMT with Chiang Kai-shek at the helm, declared that they remain the rightful government of all of China, despite the fact that they are now limited just to the island of Taiwan. And in fact, let's see, did I have a slide here about this? Not quite. Okay, so yeah, if we just go back, this is a state of affairs that actually would have remained temporary. The U.S. at this point, had already it had supported the KMT tremendously, right? But ultimately, that was not enough. And up until the outbreak of the Korean War, the U.S. was basically ready to, let the communists liberate Taiwan as well. But once we had the entrenchment of the Cold War, right, and basically once there was so much domestic pressure in the U.S. over the so-called loss of China, it became untenable to let the KMT regime in Taiwan fall. So literally days after the start of the Korean War, the U.S. basically says, okay, we are drawing a hard line, right, against the further expansion of communism, as they called it, both within Korea and across the Taiwan Strait. They sent the 7th Fleet of the U.S. Navy into the Taiwan Strait, preventing the sort of reunification of China. Right? So yeah, now question of the room: how many countries recognize Taiwan as an independent state? Is it 12?
China reaction.
Okay, so we have 12 as one position. Anyone else want to take a guess? It's like a little bit of a trick question, but okay. So the answer is actually 0. The answer is actually 0. And this owes to the fact that, as I mentioned, right, the situation at the end of the Civil War was one that, actually, left us with 2 rival governments, right? One that had lost its popular legitimacy and been overthrown, but was still being propped up in Taiwan by the United States, right? And which claimed to represent the continuation of the Republic of China to be the legitimate government of all of China, including the mainland. And then you have the People's Republic of China on the mainland, right, which is equally uncompromising in insisting on the unity of China. So what does this mean? If we go to the next slide, it means basically that every country on Earth recognizes officially the existence of a single China that includes both the mainland and Taiwan. It's just a matter of which of the 2 governments they recognize, right? What you have in light green are those remaining countries on the planet that still recognize the Republic of China in Taiwan as the legitimate government of all of them, right? And that makes it mutually exclusive, so that they can't have relations with the People's Republic, and vice versa. So it's been a pretty dwindling number, right, that recognize the ROC. I think at this point it's actually 11 UN member states plus the Vatican that will adopt Italy. But when people try to play fast and loose, right, and say that these 11 countries recognize Taiwan, in fact, none of them recognize Taiwan as an independent, the island of Taiwan as an independent country. And indeed, the government in Taiwan does not recognize itself as an independent country either. We go to the next slide. Yes. So what you see here is two different versions of the passport, right? That residents of Taiwan hold. The older version on the left clearly says Republic of China, right? And then as a result of a lot of political pressure from pro-independence elements, that has now been removed in English, but in the newer version on the right, it still says Zhonghua Minguo, the Republic of China in Chinese, right? It now reduced to saying Taiwan in English. Nonetheless, the Constitution is unchanged, right? It insists on paper still that the government that is constituted under it, right, is the legitimate government of all of China, undivided, the mainland and Taiwan. And this is why internally, right, you have this division still within Taiwan society regarding, whether to declare independence, as a Republic of Taiwan from the Republic of China, right? It's kind of a subtle point, but it's really important to recognize and to be precise about what the situation is, because across the board, Western media is are not. Go to the next slide. This manifests itself in other ways. Does anyone recognize this symbol? This is the emblem of the Marine Corps of the Republic of China, or as if you were to put it more loosely, the Taiwanese Marines, right? But as you can see very clearly, you have quite explicitly a territorial claim, not just to Taiwan, and not just to modern day mainland China, but even to Mongolia in this image, right? And this goes all the way back, actually, to 1911, when what is today the independent country of Mongolia was a part of the Qing dynasty. And when the Republic of China, and then it became de facto independent afterwards, right? And shortly after it became a socialist state, the second one in the world after the Soviet Union. But the Republic of China in particular did not recognize its independence, right? And in fact, continued formally to lay claim to all of mainland China plus Mongolia, right? At least officially, well into the 90s. Indeed, when they held China's seat at the UN, which they did all the way until 1971, they exercised exactly one veto, and that veto was for the admission of Mongolia to the UN. So weird little factoid there, but it goes to show, I think, the continuity of this claim, right, to be the government of a unified China and not of an independent Taiwan. But, and then finally, we can look at the position of the United States itself. This is a snippet from the Shanghai Communique, which basically was agreed upon by the United States and China in 1972 during Nixon's visit to China, right? And does anyone want to read, maybe in the front row for those who can't see, the first sentence or two of this paragraph? I pulled it from a PDF because people want content.
The U.S. side declared, the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. The United States government does not challenge that position. It reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese government.
Yep, no, so this in some ways is the foundation, actually, of modern U.S.-China relations, because it really got the ball rolling towards eventual normalization in 1979, and the U.S. is still officially committed to this, right? As well as every other nation that has diplomatic relations with the PRC, which is now 180 plus countries. So it's important to recognize this as well, because what you have is a more insidious project, I would say, in the media, right, of building up this idea that Taiwan is not just independent today, but it's always been independent, when that is in fact at variance with the official position, not just of the United States, not just of the 179 other countries that recognize the PRC, but actually of every country on Earth, including those that recognize the ROC in Taiwan. Nonetheless, it is true, right, that we have a substantial number, some would say a plurality, some would even say a majority, right, in Taiwan, who, according to polls, you know, are deemed to support independence from China in some way, right? And this is not just, you know, the separateness of the Republic of China, but actually saying Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, is an independent country in itself, or should be independent. And I would say that while this is increasingly true of a larger and larger portion of the population, we have to look at how this historically came to be, right? Rather than just accepting it at face value, because this would have made very little sense to people during the Cold War, when the ROC government in Taiwan was held up as the legitimate government of free China, right? And you know, the only rightful sovereign over all of China, including the mainland. So how is it that you know, how does ideological projects come about, right? And for this, I would say this is actually the most important part of our research list. And it's so important that, in fact, Evan is going to be doing a talk at All Power going specifically into this in a week and a half. But I want to cover a little bit of this topic. So, next slide. What we see here are images from an uprising that occurred in 1947 against KMT rules. So this was before the end of the Civil War. This is when the KMT still exercised control over most of mainland China, right? We're fighting, you know, a growing and strengthening communist, you know, revolution there, and in Taiwan itself, the sort of extremely despotic and corrupt nature of their rule was becoming increasingly apparent. So this all touches off on February 28, 1947, in what's called the 228 Uprising. I think the image on the left there is of, you know, large crowds of Taiwanese people setting fire to the tobacco monopoly board, and then on the right is a police station getting torched. And this happened up and down the island, right? Now there is a narrative about this that the pro-independence side puts forward today, which says that this was primarily conflict between what they call native Taiwanese, right, the Bipartisan, whose ancestors came here earlier, and, you know, this sort of foreign invading force that the KMT was bringing from mainland China, right? So they make it sort of a quasi-ethnic and identitarian conflict between the Bipartisan, right, and the white from the mainland. But go to the next slide. Actually, yes. So we'll keep that in mind for now, right? Another thing that they do is that they completely erase the role of Taiwanese communists. In fact, they erase them from history entirely. And this is deeply insidious because this is an incredibly deep and fascinating history, without which we can't fully understand how Taiwan has become what it is today. So the figure on the left is Qiao, and she actually was a founding member of the Taiwanese Communist Party back in 1928. This was actually distinct from the Communist Party of China because as a part of the Japanese Empire at the time, the Communist International, you know, basically imposed this rule where, you know, Communist parties in the colonies, right, of a given country were sort of affiliates or indeed organized underneath the Communist Party of the Colonial metropole, so in this case the Japanese Communist Party. Nonetheless, it was a very autonomous formation. It worked extensively with the CPC despite the political division. And in fact, she, you know, after a long period of imprisonment, she is then set free after the end of Japanese colonial rule, and then promptly, gets right back into organizing and fights against the KMT dictatorship. So she actually led an armed brigade, the 27th Brigade, during the 228 Uprising, and after it was crushed, she winds up leaving first for Hong Kong and then for mainland China, where she founds what's called the Taiwan Democratic Self-Government League, which today is still one of the 8 legal minor parties in China, right? The united front led by the Communist Party. A lot of people look at the name of that party, right? Taiwan Democratic Self-Government League, and they're like, what the heck? But you know, if we think about its origins, right? You know, they were fighting an authoritarian regime, right? And so for this expansive notion of democracy, which the communists themselves were also supporting, right? And the kind of self-government that was envisioned for Taiwan was as part of a socialist China, right? And it wasn't limited just to the Taiwanese Communist Party. There were also extensive underground formations of the Communist Party of China in Taiwan after 1945. They were also ultimately severely repressed. And what you see on the right actually is a monument in Beijing to some of these underground Taiwanese communist agents, right, who were arrested and executed by the Qing regime. And indeed, the suppression of both the 228 Uprising and then what's subsequently called the White Terror, right, under the Cairo dictatorship, it was actually quite protracted, right? It lasted ultimately for the entire 40 years of martial law. It was particularly intense in the 50s, right? When essentially the order of the day was to exterminate communists. And what you see here is a mass grave that was uncovered, was left the language and wasn't uncovered until 1993, with the graves of hundreds of victims, right, of the White Terror. It's in that grave. We'll go to the next slide. It's a little hard to see from here, but what we see on the left is basically a breakdown of the known victims or the known the known victims of the White Terror, right, that are buried in the known. And it's broken down into political versus non-political, right? So you see that the political victims green are a clear majority there. And indeed, if you look at the demographics, right, you see an interesting phenomenon. This is from a story about this mass grave. And it notes that of the dead who are buried there, 42% of them are women, right? So those are the people who, constitute today 85% of the total population of the island, right? Whose ancestors came earlier, whereas 58% are white women. So that means that the recent, arrivals from the mainland, right, are grossly overrepresented, actually, in the victims of the White Terror who are very few. And this goes completely against the modern day pro-independence narrative, which suggests that this was, purely a mainland versus like Taiwanese conflict, right? Or that the progenitors of today's independence movement, right, were the leaders of the opposition to the Qing. This is completely ahistorical, right? It erases the fact that disproportionately, that almost exclusively, right, the victims of the White Terror were refused communists, and disproportionately they were actually white people. They were recent migrants from the mainland, right? Next slide. So this, just to further reinforce that point, right? This guy, Chen Minzhong, was born in Taiwan under Japanese rule. He started organizing with the Taiwanese Communist Party during that time, and later participated in the 228 Uprising in 1947, and then became a victim of the White Terror, which imprisoned for several decades. And he notes that if you look at all of the victims of the White Terror, right, so 140 to 150,000, again, 40% are white, right, from the mainland. And that's way more than the actual percentage of the population. So, he says here at the bottom that, Taiwanese people, that this conflict had nothing to do with conflicts over provincial identity, right? It had everything to do with the leading role of the communists in the opposition to the Qing. And if you go to the next slide, he is sort of explicitly combating the narrative of the pro-independence camp today, where he says the Taiwan separatists were mainly Taiwanese people, as mentioned, yet the KMT never killed them. If the KMT regime's main enemy were Taiwanese people or then why didn't they kill them? In contrast, when it came to cracking down on underground communist organizations and arresting communists or communist sympathetic people, they were never this offhanded, and they were actually proposing to kill them without any execution. So, again, this isn't an actual victim, right? Someone who was born and raised in Taiwan, his family has been there for many generations, for centuries, in fact, right? But clearly laying out the falsity of this narrative that is now hegemonic to us, that it was, a Taiwan versus China, or like a islander versus mainlander conflict, and not a conflict ultimately between communism and reactionary action. But yeah, this is another figure, also from the pro-unification left. He is often considered to be the greatest Taiwanese writer of the 20th century, and in sort of a third-person autobiographical profile of himself that he wrote. I'll just read this first bit. It says, China's political view is that the division between Taiwan and mainland China was the combined result of a rapacious Japanese imperialism and the rise of American imperialist interventions through the Korean War period. The political left wing in Taiwan should focus on overcoming ethnic tensions created by imperialism and prioritize the peaceful unification of people on the principle of national self-determination. Slide. And then, so both of those two, right, ultimately end up being co-founders of the Taiwan Labor Party, which, after the end of martial law, kind of carried the torch for the pro-unification left, even though it was pretty defeated. And so the chairman today of the party, Wu Longyan, in a recent interview, it's actually from this year, 2024, around the time of the elections in Taiwan in January, he was talking about the two major parties in Taiwan, right? The KMT, which is the opposition, and the DPP, who are basically pro-independence. And he says of them, they find common ground in anti-communism against the ballistic regime. While the KMT claims that the residents of Taiwan and mainland China form one Chinese nation, separated by the sea and different ideologies, the DPP invented Taiwanese nationalism. Since they came to power 23 years ago, they managed to create a distinct Taiwanese identity out of the country. That's a very strong statement there, right? That when we think of today and what has been naturalized as like, a distinct Taiwanese identity that is incompatible with or irreconcilable with Chineseness, is actually a very recent invention and a very intentional ideological project. But nonetheless, it's one that has met with some success, right? As you can see in the survey results over time of just how people in Taiwan self-identify. You had back in 1992, so this was like around the end of, just after the end of martial law, right, and one-party rule. You had a very strong majority of the population, which I guess would amount to about 70-75% total, who identified as either exclusively Chinese or as both Chinese and Taiwanese. But then, over the course of the succeeding decades, as the pro-independence camp gains power culturally and politically, the national population identifies as exclusively Taiwanese jumps from under 20% to over 60%. That's a very hard to shift, right? But then if we dig down into people's actual attitudes about the independence question, it's a little bit more complicated. A lot of data here, I apologize, so I'll break it down a little bit more. But basically, at the very top there, what you see in black, right, is basically just maintaining the status quo and deciding at a later date, right, whether to whether to opt for independence or unification. And then in blue, the option that has actually gained probably the most over time is to maintain the status quo indefinitely. So this is this kind of, two nominal rival governments, right, in Taiwan and mainland China, without any move towards unification or independence. And then in green, also, growing precipitously, right, but still less popular, is the option of maintaining the status quo are some less popular options, right? Which involve, you know, mostly immediate independence or immediate unification, right? And so, if there is actually a hegemonic view when you break down people's opinions about this question in Taiwan, there's still like a lot of attachment to a status quo that is working fairly well, in the absence of imperialist intervention by the US, right? In that, there are no, imminent moves, right, on the part of China on the part of mainland China to escalate, by opting for military reunification, and there are extensive exchanges across the strait, right? There are millions of people from Taiwan working in the mainland. There are hundreds of thousands from the mainland in Taiwan. And so, these forces that are pushing towards independence, right? In many ways, like the hard core of pro-independence sentiment that they can count on is actually a lot smaller than it may seem. And this is with a very intentional project of rewriting the history textbooks, right? Of basically seizing control over most private media to put forward this pro-independence narrative, and this narrative about cultural separateness between Taiwan and China over the course of decades. Their project has never limited success, but definitely not total success. So again, sorry for how small the text is. These are the results of the most recent legislative election in Taiwan. The two camps are identified with green and blue, right? So the green camp, led by the Democratic Progressive Party, means sort of pro-independence. The blue camp, led by the KMT, argues for, the eventual reunification of Taiwan and mainland China, but not under the People's Republic of China, right? And they're pretty evenly split. There are a couple things to note here. One is that, neither has a majority, right? But in fact, the KMT has managed to win one more seat than the DPP, even though it won a smaller percentage of the vote. I'll get to what happened on the next slide. The last thing I want to notice is okay, why have I included all of these different parties, including a bunch that didn't get any seats? Because the Labor Party, which I was talking about, previously in this section, is all the way down at the bottom with 6,000 votes, right? So that's 0.05% of the vote. And you might be wondering then, okay, why am I talking about their political position that much? And it's because I want to illustrate that the relatively marginal nature of these pro-unification left today is not a natural consequence of the democratic development of Taiwanese politics. It comes from the fact that even though they used to lead the opposition to the KMT, they were physically liquidated, right, through arrest, imprisonment, execution, through severe fascistic political repression, to the point where they were eliminated as an opposition and where they could be replaced, as the main opposition bloc by this sort of bourgeois liberal pro-independence camp, right? And it was only after that happened that the U.S. basically stepped back and was like, okay, we're no longer going to back continued one-party rule to the hilt, right? It was only once Taiwan had been made safe for a certain flavor of democracy, right, through the elimination of communists, that it was allowed to become a liberal democracy. So, oh yeah, and so, that little anomaly that I mentioned earlier, where the KMT won more seats with fewer votes, that was actually because the Indigenous vote in Taiwan leans pretty hard towards the KMT. And this comes about in spite of the fact that, the KMT, during one-party rule, pursued a pretty harsh assimilationist project, with regards to Indigenous people as well, right? There was nonetheless great skepticism around the fact that the pro-independence camp has its roots mainly in the Han Chinese movement, and that it's introducing this ideological project that claims indigeneity to Taiwan, right? And that thereby is sort of actually erasing the actual basis, right, for exercise of cultural and national autonomy by indigenous peoples. And as an example of how, there's actually a lot of common ground here, right, between major political figures, major indigenous political figures, and this eventual project of reunification with mainland China under the People's Republic. That indigenous legislator that I mentioned earlier, Gao Jinsume, who was protesting against the enshrinement of her people at Yasukuni, right? She actually is very sympathetic to the program of socialist reunification with the rest of China, and you have a photo here on the right with Hu Jintao, who was the president of China before Xi. Right? She visited the mainland several times and was criticized by most of the political spectrum in Taiwan for doing so, but she pretty much was like, fuck you guys. She's awesome. Next slide. Okay, so I've been going on for a while now, but I kind of want to wrap up by once again taking head on one particular very insidious narrative, and the one that probably has the most central role right now in terms of the position that Taiwan plays, right? The central position that it plays in the U.S. Cold War against China. This is the idea that when it comes to potential conflict over Taiwan, China, and not the United States, is and would be the aggressor. So, go to the next slide. Deng Xiaoping, who succeeded Mao as Chinese leader in 1978, articulated what remains to this day, with some amendments, the official Chinese government position about reunification. This is in a lecture that he delivered in New Jersey, I think in 1982 or 3. And he basically says, I'm just going to quote actually the whole thing because it's pretty striking, I think. He says, after reunification with the motherland, the Taiwan Special Administrative Region will assume a unique character and may practice a social system different from that of the mainland. It will enjoy independent judicial power. There will be no need to go to Beijing for final adjudication. It may maintain its own army, provided it does not threaten the mainland. The mainland will not station anyone in Taiwan, neither troops nor administrative personnel will go there. The party, governmental, and military systems of Taiwan will be administered by the Taiwan authorities themselves. And so this is like a degree of autonomy that actually has almost no direct parallel with any other process of incomplete national liberation, right? Where basically a state that was born through a process of progressive or socialist national liberation recovers a piece of its territory. Almost always, it will reincorporate it completely under exactly the same system, right? And what we have here being proposed for Taiwan is an even more expansive version of the one country, two systems framework under which Hong Kong and Macau were basically restored to China after centuries of British and Portuguese colonialism, right? And I just want to, emphasize here that this is the official position, more or less, maybe minus the bit about an independent military, that China continues to hold today with regards to what reunification is. It is not trying to impose its own system that holds the mainland on Taiwan, and that's made this very clear in statement after statement for decades. What's also made clear is that armed reunification is an absolute last resort, and will only come about when all alternatives have been exhausted. Now let's look at the actual position of the United States, right, and the way that it treats Taiwan. So during the Cold War, what you had was the Taiwan being positioned as basically a bastion of anti-communism and fascism, right? If you look at this image on the left, it looks pretty damn fascistic. That's because it is. It's a meeting of the World Anti-Communist League, which was originally founded in Taipei in the 60s and remains headquartered there to this day. Though it's been renamed the World League for Freedom and Democracy or something like that. You can maybe make out in that top mural there this image where like the glorious light of anti-communism is emanating from Taiwan itself. And then you have here various commemorative stamps, right, with again the very fascistic logo of this organization, and which were printed in Taiwan under the KMT dictatorship. Just to give you a sense of what this network looked like, it was truly global in scope. It included not just other anti-communist dictatorships in Asia, like the Kok Chung Ki regime in South Korea, Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam, the Marcos regime in the Philippines, but also the Moonies, right, the Unification Church of Sun Myat Moon. And then in the rest of the world, it included numerous death squads in Central America, right, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, included the Nicaraguan Contras, and in terms of its U.S. and European-based membership, it was made up mostly of adherents of the Ku Klux Klan and various neo-Nazi groups. So that was basically what the U.S. enforced in Taiwan, right, over the course of the Cold War. And go to the next slide. It also arms the ROC government to the hilts and continues to do so today, right? Even though it broke off diplomatic relations with them, it's introduced all of this new ad hoc legislation that allows it to keep funneling billions of dollars of weapons to Taiwan. So it's a little hard to see the scale, but at the top it's $10 billion, right? And you can see that the quantity of weapon sales to Taiwan from the U.S. actually peaked under Trump. I think that's 2019 or 2020 there, at above $10 billion. And it's remained at a quite elevated level in recent decades. Slide. And the reason why it's doing this is because of Taiwan's very strategic location. And it's really through this lens and nothing alone, right, that the U.S. sees Taiwan and its people. In particular, it envisions Taiwan, as you can see on the left, as part of the so-called First Island Chain, which extends basically all the way down from the mainland of Japan through the Ryukyus or Okinawa, through Taiwan, and then now through the Philippines and around the South China Sea, right? In such a way as to basically completely encircle China. And the U.S. has, basically since the start of the Cold War, very intentionally installed neo-colonial regimes or its own military bases all the way up and down this island chain, right? As well as the second island chain on the outside. But really the linchpin of it, because of its proximity to the mainland and because of its history, right, as a launch pad for other colonial powers to wage war on China, is Taiwan. And this was articulated in 1950 by Douglas MacArthur, who very notably said, as this in this highlighted portion here, Formosa in the hands of a hostile power could be compared to an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Can anyone name another place that the U.S. thinks of or is referred to as an unsinkable aircraft carrier? There are a number of examples, but there's one that's very salient. That's right, yes. So, we go to the next slide. Again, this is something that Reagan Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, said, that Israel is the largest American aircraft carrier of the world that cannot be sunk. And it's really the same logic, applying, in this case, at both ends of the Asian continent, right, in terms of U.S. grand strategy, is that, with no regard to, the peoples of any given part of the world, right? Whether it nominally upholds a sort of pseudo-sovereignty, right, as it does in the case of Taiwan, or whether it ruthlessly represses it, as in the case of the Palestinians, the prevailing logic of U.S. empire is to see these locations as unsinkable aircraft carriers, right, as loci for force protection. And, it is the, intensification of that mad logic, right, that is driving the U.S. to basically escalate to the point of regional, perhaps nuclear war in multiple places in the world. Yeah, so as a concrete example of how intertwined these are, right, back in April, Congress passed a funding bill, very quickly signed by Joe Biden, that apportioned a total of $95 billion of aid, military aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. So it was all bundled together in one package, making the imperial prerogative is very, very explicit, right? And what's interesting is if you break down the vote on each of these different pieces of the bill, for Israel, it passed by, or sorry, for Ukraine, it passed by 311 to 112, right? Because the right wing of the Republican Party, for various reasons, did not go down with that. For Israel, it was 366 to 58. Again, they lost much of the left wing of the Democrats there, kind of, But then for Taiwan, 385 to 34. So that was the most unified, the most bipartisan vote between the three, right? And it indicates sort of the centrality, of like arming Taiwan to the hilt against the express will of the majority of its own people, right? To the overall U.S. imperial project. And the fact that that has more of a bipartisan consensus than even USA to Ukraine or to Israel. Slide. And this is coming not just in terms of U.S. interests acting as like the hub, but directly, in terms of the official rhetoric and a lot of the symbolism, right, from Taiwanese authorities as well. This is the Taipei 101 skyscraper lit up right after October 7th in the colors of the Israeli flag. And so I want to finish at long last slide on a quote from Mao, which I also opened my previous talk at All Power about China and Palestine with, because I think it's very apropos and it speaks to the global scope of this imperial project and the absolute disregard and indeed contempt that it has for the lives of the millions and millions of people affected by it. Where Mao told the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1965 that imperialism is afraid of China and of the Arabs. Israel and Formosa, aka the regime in Taiwan, are bases of imperialism in Asia. You are the gate of the great comet, and we are the rear. They created Israel for you and Formosa for us. Their goal is the same. And what this speaks to, and the note that I want to conclude on is the artificiality, right, of both the partition of Palestine, the partition of Korea, the former partition of Vietnam, and the ongoing partition of China, right? Of course, Israel, something of a different situation because of the specifically settler colonial nature of that partition. But nonetheless, the artificiality, right, of each of those political separations is something that we have to keep returning to. And the fact that the only just solution, right, the only just future in each of these imperially imposed divisions is national unity, right, around an anti-imperial project. Whatever that may look like specifically, right, it's going to take a different form, in Palestine than it did in Vietnam, than it will in Korea, than it will with regards to China, whether that be one country, two systems, or something else. But, if we truly believe in an anti-imperial project, then I think that this is the point that we need to. So, that's my last slide of content, but I want to do a plug, finally, for part 2 of this series, which my comrade Kevin, over in the corner, is going to be giving at All Power on Monday, the 19th. And that will be specifically diving way more into the history of underground communism in Taiwan in particular, with this translation that he did of a biographical portrait of one of the, many communist organizers who, were first repressed, in many cases executed by the White Terror, and whose names and whose political commitments have then been erased a second time by, the historical revision of the Taiwan independence. So, with that, I want to finally wrap up, and thank you for your time.
Is there time to respond to some of the slides?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the talk. Really appreciate all the information collected here. But yeah, some of the information on the slides are really interesting to me. As someone who was born and lived in Taiwan, my whole family still lives there, in fact. And yeah, some of the points that were brought up is that we brought up that Taiwan's not distinguished from China linguistically, ethnically, all those points, which I agree with you on those points, but the reason that it's also not distinguished from China in those ways are actually because of Chinese colonization. Because you said that the languages are still the same, right? But why is that? In all the schools, Mandarin is the primary language that's taught in all the schools. When you talk about the KMT, it's true that they're the fascists. They're Chinese fascists that came from China, anti-communists, right? And when they came, they imposed this fascist government, no doubt, that made Chinese the language in all the schools, wiped out indigenous peoples. And we talked about the white terror victims, 42% of them being Russian, 58% of them being white Shinran, but indigenous people were nowhere mentioned in there, despite many of them being murdered. Not necessarily for anti-communism, but because the KMT administration saw them as a threat, local resistance as a threat. And I think that when people talk about like Taiwanese independence, there's the misconception that when people talk about Taiwanese independence, they're supporting U.S. imperialism, which isn't true a lot of the times. When people talk about Taiwanese independence, they're not necessarily supporting the Taiwanese government, because I believe that the KMT should be abolished. They're definitely anti-communist, they're definitely fascist. At the same time, that doesn't make the Chinese colonization that's imposed on indigenous people there any better. And when you talk about the percentages of the ethnic people there, most of them being non-Chinese, right? And how that's, when you talk about the ethnic population, they're being mostly non-Chinese. Yeah, that's true, but why is that? And that's because of Chinese colonization at the same time. In the first slide, you mentioned European and Japanese land settlers, but I'm also curious what makes China not settlers or colonizers, when even to this day, it's still the KMT. They are a force of Chinese colonization. And indigenous people in Taiwan have long been seeking autonomy. They've long been asking for autonomy from the government. And when you talk about the KMT, that's not necessarily, like, yes, they are Taiwanese fascists, but at the same time, they're Chinese fascists as well. They came from China to Taiwan, and that part is often ignored because people will look at the KMT and say, oh, they're Taiwanese fascists, but okay, where do they come from? And where do they impose their government? And the talk about the reunification of China as well. Taiwan was never truly unified with China. But the Chinese government, they don't really talk about the Taiwanese indigenous people, or else they simply defend Taiwan from U.S. imperialism instead of imposing its language and its culture on the people. Yeah, and not to mention, when we talk about like Dutch rule, Japanese rule in Taiwan, right? The Han racism, the Chinese racism, is almost never mentioned throughout this discourse, despite Han people often referring to indigenous people of Taiwan as eastern savages, uncivilized, wild, other slurs you can name. And unfortunately, it's just conveniently left out a lot of the times.
Good. Yeah, I think that you raised those points because I think a lot of them are actually quite compatible with the analysis that I put forward. And in particular, I think we're completely on the same page about the nature of the TNP regime, right? When it comes to questions of sovereignty and self-determination and the language of national liberation, right? We want to use those terms. I think we need to be very clear about, on the one hand, the fact that Indigenous people of Taiwan, like, any, such constituted people, deserve the ability to exercise, that kind of self-determination, right? That kind of, autonomy, their land, some traditional land, their resources, everything, right? The fact that has been systematically denied. But who has systematically denied it, right? It's been a succession of regimes, some of which I think were unambiguous, right? Like the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Japanese. And then, I didn't necessarily come down on one way or another on the question of whether, Chinese sovereignty, whether the Qing period or the ROC qualify as colonial, right? I have no disagreement with you on, the fact that, particularly under the ROC, the policy that it undertook with regards to Indigenous people was an assimilationist one, right? It was an effort to sort of like, erase the basis for its sort of exercise of self-determination. I think that's a little bit of a different picture when it comes to the Qing dynasty for the reasons that I mentioned, right? At least in the highways. But again, that's also sort of a partial caveat. However, what should be noted is that precisely none of these, prior Chinese governments, right? Here I'm including the ROC government after 1949, which only exercised sovereignty over Taiwan, was the China that we're talking about today, the People's Republic of China, right? Which has a very clearly stated policy, which it has adhered to, of regional ethnic autonomy, right? Which entails concretely an exercise of, regional self-determination in cultural, linguistic, educational, and in many respects in administrative affairs by, non-patent minority populations, right? In pretty much all areas of mainland China where they exist in significant numbers. And in fact, there have been position papers put out by, the offices of the Chinese government that are, called the People's Republic of China, right? Which are dedicated to the project of reunification, which address specifically what this would look like in the case of Indigenous people in Taiwan. And the specific proposals they put forward go far beyond what any actual government in Taiwan, right? Whether the ROC or the DPP more recently has ever been. So, I want to make that very clear, right? That when we're talking about various forms of oppression of the Indigenous population, whether we characterize them as colonial or not, those all correspond to previous, like across the board, reactionary systems of government, which were, which the current government of the People's Republic of China formed a hard break in 1949, through its explicit commitment to a policy of uniting China as a multi-ethnic socialist democracy. And, we can argue as well, I think, about, okay, have they stuck to the letter of this commitment in every case? Obviously, the execution has not been proven, right? Obviously, it's been dissent in various places through imperialist interference as well. But, the fact is that what we're talking about, right, is specifically a prospective socialist reunification of Taiwan with mainland China. Which would entail political changes, in fact, on both sides of the street, right? To sort of sum up, like, this is why, there still exists, today, a considerable, sentiment within the Indigenous population that is highly skeptical of the see it as their project of liberation, right? They see it as basically one group of Chinese people who are trying to break away from another group of Chinese people, and who are doing so, right, using language that appropriates indigenous identity and also serves as a thin fig leaf to cover a notion of independence that would in fact entail the continued and actually further entrenched neo-colonial domination of the United States.
So to respond to that point, like you say reunification for socialist China, right? And you say the appropriation of language appropriation of language for indigenous people. But I'm curious as to how socialist China plans to actually support indigenous people in Taiwan, because you also mentioned that in your slide that 24% of Taiwanese now identify as Austronesian. And I'm also curious where these slides get their numbers from, because yeah, it's true that most of the people in Taiwan are not Chinese, and the EMP again is an authoritarian government that is fascist and is a form of Chinese colonization as well. I'm curious why that isn't recognized as a form of Chinese colonization, where they are Chinese fascists who came to Taiwan to oppose this government. And as for the indigenous sovereignty part, I'm curious why saying indigenous people of Taiwan deserve sovereignty, deserve autonomy is a form of appropriation when some people, while there also is people attempting to use that language to support like certain parties, but indigenous people in Taiwan currently, for example, don't have the rights to hunt on their land, don't have the rights to function as an autonomous self-governing community. They don't have the right to their ancestral territory, and that's because of Chinese colonization. There's no time around that. But when we talk about indigenous sovereignty, often that's the response that we get. And again, let's also remember that Taiwan fascism, the KMT, it's created by the Chinese, it's not created by the US or any sort of Western source. Yes, it's backed by the US, but it originated from China, and it just happened to become, have Taiwan become a space due to its strategic location. When we say that supporting indigenous sovereignty, for example, in what we call, quote unquote, Middle East now Palestine, we're not supporting Israel, right? We're supporting the Palestinians. And so when I say supporting indigenous sovereignty in Taiwan, of course I'm not supporting the KMT, I'm supporting indigenous Taiwanese people. But people often say that Palestine is a litmus test for a land back, but I disagree. I actually believe that the litmus test for a land back is Taiwan, because I don't see how you can support Chinese reunification in terms of Taiwan, and how China actually plans to give the land back to the indigenous people.
Okay, I want to clarify a couple things.
And actually, just a quick point. And also, all of this discourse around Taiwan, it's always talked about by mainland Chinese people. And that's honestly also just like super concerning too.
So this is why I, included the slide specifically indigenous Taiwanese voices who, both have a long history of, combating pan-Chinese chauvinism in Taiwan, right? Combating historical revisionism around Japanese colonialism, and who are at the very least quite sympathetic to the idea of reunification with the People's Republic of China, like Qiao, right, who is a national legislator, and has like a lifetime of activism around this, right? And I'm not holding up as an isolated example. If you look at the resource list, then building the stock off of, it includes a number of other indigenous voices, along along those lines, right? You know, you might throw it back at me, okay, maybe those are starting to get right? But nonetheless, I think if she's, you know, getting elected from a constituency on that specific platform, then it speaks to the fact that it has a pretty substantial popularity, right? I'm not claiming that there's a consensus about it. There, you know, obviously isn't. So that was to address your, you know, that last one, right? Regarding other issues that you raised, the appropriation that I'm talking about is the appropriation of indigeneity, the claim to indigeneity by people who are not indigenous to Taiwan. And that, you know, includes the large majority of the population of Taiwan, right, whose ancestors, right, migrated to Taiwan from the mainland in the last several centuries, right, and who, you know, are, who by and large form the social base for the modern day Taiwan independence movement, right? Because when people talk about Taiwan independence from China as an actually existing, you know, political product and a proposal that's on the table, you know, you have to look at, you know, who's actually proposing it, the form that you know, it would take, right? And you know, the you know, the whole point of this presentation was to illustrate that the actual social forces behind this product in Taiwanese society are, you know, the vast majority of them are not indigenous, right? And in fact, you know, do not incorporate any kind of project of indigenous liberation within that vision that we have. What they instead are putting forward is an ethnic chauvinist program, right? Surrounding the creation of you know, a supposedly distinct like ethnic cultural identity for Venezuelans, right? Who are Han-Chinese, just like the white Chinese, right? Just like, you know, who came in with the KMT. And, you know, who nonetheless are appropriating the language of indigeneity, who nonetheless are claiming a sort of native status in Taiwan, right? For the purpose of confusing this issue to Western audiences and making it think that it is, you know, a sort of conventional, like, you know, national liberation project from colonialism. When in fact, if we are to be, you know, if we take for granted this rhetorical claim, right, that China executed a separate colonial project in Taiwan for centuries, right, starting in the Qing dynasty, then that means like the vast majority, right, like 95, 97% plus of supporters of modern day Taiwan independence are themselves separatists, right? And what does that mean? It means the kind of independence that they are proposing, right, has more in common with the independence of the United States from Britain as a settler colony than an actual anti-colonial product of national liberation led by indigenous peoples, right? That's what I'm saying, is that I'm talking about the actually existing independence movement and its extremely fraught relationship with indigenous peoples and the actual history of unmistakably colonial regimes like that in Taiwan, right? And the fact that they, by and large, whitewash those colonial crimes, particularly the ones that were committed against indigenous peoples.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. I'm definitely not saying at all that the Taiwanese independence movement is pro-indigenous or is not anti-communist. I definitely completely agree that the mainstream pro-independence movement in Taiwan is inherently anti-communist and not supportive of the indigenous people. But what I'm saying is that supporting Taiwan means supporting